Space, the final frontier. This is the Observer's Notebook, the official podcast of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. Its mission to explore the solar system, to seek out new observations and data, to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. And now the host of the Observer's Notebook, Tim Robertson.
Welcome to episode 137 of the Observer's Notebook, the official podcast of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. My name is Tim Robertson. I'm the host of the Observer's Notebook and also the coordinator of the training program within the ALPO. Thanks for downloading and listening. This podcast also kicks off our 75th anniversary. That's right. The ALPO is 75 years old this year, and we're going to be talking to some of the old-timers in the organization to find out what it was like way back when. The ALPO collects and analyzes observations of various solar system bodies and associated phenomenon, and publishes detailed reports concerning these bodies in its quarterly publication, the Journal of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. This podcast depends upon donations from you, our listeners, to keep it alive. If you enjoy what you hear on the podcast, you can donate to it via Patreon. You can give as little as $1 a month. If you feel even more generous, for $5, you receive early access to the podcast before it goes public. For a monthly donation of $10, you receive a copy of the Novice Observer's Handbook. And for $35 a month, you receive producer credits on the podcast. You can find out more at www.patreon.com/observersnotebook. And if you'd like to join the ALPO, membership begins at only $18 a year. For more information, find us on the internet at www.alpo-astronomy.org. And we're also on the Facebook. Just search for ALPO Astronomy. And also this podcast has a Facebook page as well. Just search for Observer's Notebook. And if you want to enjoy every single episode of the podcast, please subscribe. That way you'll never miss another episode. And now, really excited about this one, episode 137. Hope you enjoy. All right, I'd like to welcome everybody back to this edition of the Observer's Notebook podcast. We are celebrating 75 years of the ALPO. Amazing time. And I'm very lucky to have on the podcast today one of the old timers, Tom Dobbins. Welcome to the podcast, Tom.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah. Now, why don't you just give everybody a little bit of background about yourself before we get into the conversation?
Okay. I am a presently retired research chemist, still doing a good bit of astronomy writing in my dotage. Mm-hmm. And as far as my history in amateur astronomy, I consider myself very fortunate that subjects that I took an interest in as a really young child continued to interest me all my life. It's quite a blessing. Mm-hmm. My interest in astronomy was kindled, and I can still recall the moment, by a How and Why Wonder book, a book called The Moon, published in 1963, written by a fellow whose other writings I'm utterly unfamiliar with, named Felix Sutton. But it was profusely illustrated with a lot of neat artwork, and it contained an illustration showing the birth of the moon by the primordial Earth splitting, Darwin's old theory, right? Not Charles, but his sons. And for some reason, I was just transfixed by that illustration and became fascinated by the moon and planets. In 1965, when I was 7 years old, I was given my first telescope, and very fortunately, it was a really good one. Not one of the 60 millimeter department store refractors that can ruin a budding interest in astronomy. It was a Criterion RV6 Dynoscope.
Oh my goodness. I love that telescope. I had that as well. I wish I still had it.
I think many people who cut their teeth with those instruments still wish they had them. And surviving specimens are quite coveted, given the ads I see on cloudy nights and eBay.
That's true.
But they tended to have excellent optics, uniformly excellent optics, in fact, and mechanically sound, and really did not disappoint when you looked at the planets through them.
Very true.
Some years ago, and it's probably almost a quarter of a century ago, I had the opportunity to meet John Craywalk Jr. His father, John Craywalk Sr., had founded Criterion, and the tale he told me, parenthetically, is rather interesting. His father was a mechanical engineer by training who was an executive with Colt Firearms. And he was on the golf course one day with Hugh Rice, who I believe was with the Hayden Planetarium. And Craywalk himself had no interest in astronomy, but Rice convinced him that the man who could bring to market a decent reflecting telescope would become wealthy. And that led to the birth of Criterion.
Oh, my goodness. That's interesting. I did not know that. Yeah. Now, you along with your professional background, you're also quite the author. And I have to say that Introduction to Observing and Photographing the Solar System is, I run the training program for the ALPO, and that's required reading for every single student in the program, because it tells you everything you need to know about observing and photographing the solar system. It's an excellent, excellent book. And you co-authored that with two of my favorite people in the world, too, Don Parker and Chick Capon.
They were certainly two of my favorite people, and both had a profound influence on me. Of course, the book was illustrated largely with Don Parker's magnificent silver halide photography.
Right.
And of course, although the book has gone through a second edition, it still retains its section on silver halide photography, which is, I suppose now, kind of like having the ultimate guide to buggy whips after the invention of the internal combustion engine.
Wait, you're talking about a thing called film?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, yeah. I think I've heard of that in the past.
So in that respect, the book is unfortunately hopelessly obsolete. I assume most readers of the last generation have never even set foot in a darkroom.
That's true.
But the rest of the book is somewhat eternal. Looking back on it, I know one of the introductory chapters, Cosmic Setting, speculated about the existence of planets around other stars. And of course, now we realize just what a strange place the solar system is, based on exoplanets. But much of it is held up. Well, in the words of an old ad by the Irish Tourism Authority, there's a great future in nostalgia.
Well, it's a wonderful book. It's got, like I said, it's a required reading for anybody in the training program. So I'm sure you're still selling a few copies out there wherever they might be located. But it's excellent book. And you also write tons of articles for Sky and Telescope magazine as well, right?
Yes, I've been a contributing editor there for about 18 years, and written quite a few articles. Right now, I'm responsible for the bi-monthly column exploring the solar system. I, in alternate months, have something on the planets, and Chuck Wood has something about the moon. And I've also started to write stories for the magazine's online news website or blog, As a matter of fact, I just completed one today about the discovery of anomalous carbon isotopes in sediments on Mars that is kind of tantalizing evidence that Mars may once have harbored life. But I'm an old enough fellow that my interest in the planets, which is undiminished, I was born at a particularly fortunate time. In one of the very earliest, perhaps the first issue of Astronomy magazine, there was an article by Carl Sagan called A Very Special Time. Mm. And in that, he noted that, and this is circa 1973, yep, that every previous generation of human beings who have ever lived grew up wondering and went to their graves wondering about very fundamental questions about the planets. Mm-hmm. And he noted that my generation's children and grandchildren will grow up reading all those answers in textbooks, and that the very best time to be alive is when you grow up wondering, but you end up knowing. Mm. And in that sense, that is typical of what you refer to as ALPO's old hands. That's the era that we grew up in. And
that's true.
We're very fortunate that we did.
Yeah, I think we're about the same age, and the background sounds very similar with that as well. Yeah. Yeah. Now, was there a person that sparked your interest in astronomy that you ran across, or a teacher?
Aside from that book, which kindled it, mm-hmm. I would say that my uncle, my mother's twin brother, who was a very successful executive, an engineer by training with a manufacturing company, he was an ATM himself, had a stupendously equipped machine shop in the basement of his sprawling estate, taught me as a pup how to drill and tap a hole and operate a lathe and a vertical mill.
Nice.
And he is the one who gave me that dynoscope.
Oh.
And also, for a brief period of time, circa 1980, helped me when I established the Dobbins Instrument Company to make telescopes, an exercise that proved that the easiest way to make a small fortune is to start with a bigger one. But I would say that he was instrumental in sustaining my interests and helping me. And in the local community of amateur astronomers in Cleveland, and my native Cleveland, Ohio, great city, much maligned, and sadly part of the Rust Belt and in decline. But Cleveland was a city with a great astronomy tradition. It had been the home of Warner and Swasey, who built many of the mounts and mechanical components for what were then the world's biggest and best telescopes, like the Yerkes and Lick refractors.
Very true.
Case Western Reserve University was in Ohio. The Cleveland Astronomical Society met at the Warner and Swasey Observatory on Taylor Road, which had twin domes, one housing the 9.5-inch refractor, Warner and Swasey components, Brashear objective lens that had been the personal telescope of Warner and Swasey, and another dome housed a Schmidt camera. Believe it or not, even in the 1960s, you could do meaningful deep sky photography from metropolitan Cleveland. That observatory, sadly, literally is in a state of physical collapse. It's but long abandoned. But Cleveland had a very thriving community of amateur astronomers. The fellow that I particularly bonded with, Ken Schneller, who was about a decade my senior, but Ken was a prolific contributor to ALPO, particularly during the 1960s. Sadly, he's now gone to his reward, but Ken was a very gifted observer. He was an optician by profession. He had a very fine 8-inch f9 long focus Newtonian that he had ground and polished and figured the mirror of. And he was I would say, a particularly prolific observer of the moon and Mars.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the Dobbins Instrument Company. What type of instruments did you make?
We made initially refractors.
Oh, my.
Largely using objective lenses purchased from Jaegers on Long Island, but occasionally having objective lenses made for us by companies like D&G Optical. And the instruments were quite expensive. We also made a number of reflectors, including what for a time was the largest telescope operated by amateur astronomers in the world. A local ATM, Norm Oberly, who ground and polished several really big mirrors made with blanks of General Electric quartz that GE donated to him. But one of his mirrors was a 31-inch full thickness, 1:6 thickness ratio, by the way, a truly massive piece of silicon dioxide. But he ground and polished and figured that to a really good parabola of f7 and had it in a rather primitive altazimuth mount in his yard. And
that's a massive telescope.
It is a massive telescope. And the founder of a rather successful pump company in Mansfield, Ohio, who was an amateur astronomer, Warren Rupp. Rupp provided the funds to the Mansfield Area Astronomical Society to buy a huge ash dome, and a local engineer who was a member of the Cuyahoga County Astronomy Club named Gary Cater did much of the mechanical design, but in a big skeleton tube on a huge cross-axis English-style mount with twin concrete piers, that instrument came together, and access to the eyepiece was achieved by means of a self-propelled scissors lift that cost a king's ransom, but could loft 2 or possibly even 3 brave souls to the eyepiece. And there is still an annual astronomical get-together in Ohio at what is known as the Hidden Hollow Observatory. Sadly, a number of years ago, the original optics to that instrument were destroyed. Somebody apparently, as I've been told the story, wanting to remove and clean the secondary mirror, which had a minor axis of a whopping 7 inches, kept the tube vertical while removing it, rather than horizontal. And that
gravity took over.
That elliptical secondary, combined with the massive mechanics that held it, went plummeting. The full focal length almost of the telescope struck the primary in the center, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Oh, heartbreaking. Oh, my
I
goodness.
believe that the mirror has been replaced, unfortunately, with one of considerably shorter focal length. As far as having an instrument, well, as you can imagine, at f7, the instrument initially had a rather modest central obstruction and was an absolutely stunning planetary instrument when it was in thermal equilibrium. But that was the biggest single project of the Dobbins Instrument Company.
Amazing. So, you know optics. You've been around telescopes your entire life. Do you have a dream telescope that you would love to have?
I do. I had it and I sold it. And I've regretted it ever since. Shortly before the SL9 impacts on Jupiter in 1994, the year before, after having used a 6-inch refractor of my own construction for many years, I purchased a 10-inch f9 mirror that I commissioned a Utah company that still exists called Nova Optical Systems to make. I remember the dialogue that preceded its purchase. You could specify within a reasonable range the focal ratio of the mirror you wanted, and the price for a 10-inch f9 mirror was surprisingly modest, something like $400.
Oh.
And my next letter, this is in the era before email, said, I'm a really anal retentive planetary observer, and I really, really want the best possible figure on the mirror. And I believe for an extra $50, certainly less than $100, he said, okay, well, and the mirror turned out to be exquisite. And the 10-inch f9 system had a very modest central obstruction. The instrument was equipped with a fan and an aluminum tube lined with cork and then flocked. You get much beyond 10 inches in conventional thickness mirrors, and they take a long while to equilibrate thermally. They've got a lot of thermal inertia. Happily, with the aid of the fan, this would reach thermal equilibrium quite quickly. It had a central obstruction of only 15% and a curved secondary support. But I would say that instrument gave me some of the most exquisite views of the planets I've ever enjoyed, including on one memorable night in October of 1997. Don Parker of ALPO, Jeff Bish of ALPO, a number of ALPO luminaries were there, along with the late Tom Cave, a great telescope maker in his own right.
Definitely.
And a real kindred spirit, David Graham, who was Saturn section coordinator of the British Astronomical Association. And that night featured the only night that I've ever encountered in my life of truly perfect seeing from Ohio. Tom Cave remarked that in his 6 decades of observing, he'd only seen seeing that good a number of times you could count on the fingers of a hand.
Wow.
But the image of Saturn looked like you were looking at an absolutely static engraving without a tremor, without a ripple, at any magnification. The optimal magnification turned out to be 550. The only reason that you didn't want to go any higher is that the image just grew a bit dim and colors were less saturated. But the rings did look like a phonograph record.
Wow.
And it was interesting. There was a rare thermal inversion that night. My home was on a hillside overlooking the little town of Coshocton, Ohio, which had a pulp paper mill. And you could tell there was a temperature inversion because the entire area had an unpleasant pumpkin-like odor. All of the emissions from that paper mill were being retained, but naked eye stars, there was absolutely no scintillation. And I will never get over how fortunate I was to see Saturn like that. It was truly a revelation.
That's phenomenal.
But to be in the company of those other people at the time.
That makes it whole different story right there. Yeah.
Yes.
And
a few years later, I sold that telescope. It's still here. Well, it was sold to a chap in Florida who still operates it, a fellow named Mike Palomiti, who, upon putting it into service, said that it surpassed the performance of his 8-inch Zeiss refractor.
Oh, my goodness.
And another ALPO luminary, Carlos Hernandez, occasionally uses that instrument and sings its praises. With the advent of CCD and webcam imaging, I sold it in order to buy a C14, which probably was a better instrument for imaging, but which was certainly not a better instrument for a visual observer.
Right. Now, are you more of a visual guy than an imager?
Well, I became heavily involved, and I would say for a brief period of time, I was one of the pioneers of video imaging back in the days when, and of course, everything was analog, but for example, you could buy analog, black and white, relatively sensitive security cameras.
Right.
And record on VHS, or better yet, HVHS. And that was capable of producing some really stunning results, even as far as image capture on the moon. Not so much on the planets. And of course, at the time, the stacking of images, individual frames, to reduce noise and to select the sharpest frames was an incredibly tedious, time-consuming manual exercise. In 2001, I co-authored a book called Video Astronomy.
I've got that on my shelf.
Which was doomed to be rendered obsolete within 2 years. And I would say that in the field of planetary observing, the year 2003 will be remembered the way the year 1066 is in British history, the Norman invasion, a watershed year. In that year, webcams like the 2U cam began to be widely employed in conjunction with free software like Registax that made it possible to almost effortlessly combine a number of images that reduce noise to a negligible level. And I can still remember 2003 was the year of the most favorable Mars apparition since the Pleistocene era, as far as the planet's size and position in the sky. And the very first Mars images I obtained with a webcam were stunningly superior to the best photographs with silver halide film ever obtained by Earl Slifer at Lowell Observatory. And it was an absolutely exhilarating experience. I consciously remembered at the time the film Patton, where George C. Scott, before confronting Rommel at the Battle of El Agheila in North Africa, looked in the mirror and said, "All my life I've wanted to lead men in desperate battle, and today I'm going to do it." And I remember thinking, all my life I wanted to take images of the planets like this, and by God, now I can do it. Within 6 months, the gloss faded from that apple, and my thought was, gosh, now anybody can do this.
That's right.
And planetary imaging became almost a competitive sport. And there were some real talents in the field. Don Parker made the transition from silver halide film to digital imaging and was among the best.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Damian Peach in Britain is the prodigy who to this day is unsurpassed.
Right.
But suddenly there were a large number of imagers, and when one had the sense that, well, somebody's going to take a better image tonight than I ever will, knowing that it was somewhat a competitive sport, I returned to my roots largely as a visual observer and have remained so ever since.
Yeah, I've got a CCD camera in my toolbox of my astronomy things, and I don't use it. I'd rather stick my eye. I'm one of the rare breeds, that I put my eye to the eyepiece now instead of a camera, and it's the first thing I do, and it's the last thing I do when I'm observing, and it gives me more satisfaction because it's my memory that I don't need to share, but it's what I'm seeing, and it shows the skill of an observer too to be able to pick out things that are in photographs.
Well, I will say this in response to your remark, and that is that without exception, the very best imagers of the planets, because processing digital images is an art, and it can be done very poorly. The result of how some people do it looks like an impressionist painting. But the very best imagers, Damian Peach, Parker, all were intimately familiar with the visual appearance of the planets. And that knowledge of how the planets actually appear visually guided their image processing and is what really is ultimately responsible for the quality of their work.
Excellent point. Now, how did you get involved with the ALPO?
Like anyone interested in the planets in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it was the organization to join. I also had the advantage that Walter Haas grew up in Alliance, Ohio, and occasionally returned to Ohio. And I, on a number of occasions, had the chance to meet Walter, and in later years, have him stay under my roof. So my involvement with ALPO was also accelerated by a burgeoning and later enduring friendship with Walter.
Talk to us about Walter Haas. Look, I've talked about him on this podcast before. We had people on the podcast that said he's the reason they joined the ALPO because of his handwritten letters and things like that early on. But give us some information about Walter.
Walter was an excellent correspondent. Um, I still treasure his letters. He, in person, was a soft-spoken, somewhat introverted man, given to occasional flashes of humor delivered with a twinkle in his eye, and of course was also whip smart and very cautious in his science.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that as far as interpreting observational results, well, for example, I suppose that if after I go to my reward, my name will be remembered, one of the things that it will be associated with began with an article that appeared in Sky and Telescope in 1999 that I co-authored with my frequent collaborator, Bill Sheehan. And it was called The TLP Myth, TLP meaning Transient Lunar Phenomena, subtitled A Brief for the Prosecution, in which I would like to think that we analyzed a few classic TLP sightings and demonstrated quite convincingly that they were illusory. That work was followed up by the chapter about the subject in Epic Moon, the chapter that Bill and I wrote about the history of lunar exploration through the telescope, and subsequently in other places. And I do think it's resulted in kind of a paradigm shift in the field of lunar studies. I'm reminded of what one Irish social historian wrote about witchcraft, that in 1650, every educated man in Europe believed in witchcraft. In 1750, no one did. And I think TLPs, as they were conceived, meaning outgassing, residual volcanism, some endogenic phenomenon on the moon in a few preferred sites like the central peak of Alphonsus or in the crater Aristarchus, that's no longer given much credence. Now, interestingly enough, I think the first major paper that Walter wrote was for the Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, shortly after the Second World War, called Does Anything Ever Happen on the Moon? And of course, there were a legion of TLP reports published in the pages of the ALPO journal, peaking in the 60s, but certainly continuing well into the 70s. And, I can remember my exchanges with Walter about the subject. And although he had really embraced TLPs, he was very mentally flexible. And I remember him uttering the words, well, there's a difference between an open mind and an empty head. And I think Walter's feelings on the subject changed over the years. But Walter did have a towering intellect. Actually, he told me a story that's worth repeating that I think many people are unfamiliar with.
Okay.
Walter was a mathematician by training.
True.
And for a short period of time, right after the Second World War, he was at White Sands, New Mexico, along with Wernher von Braun and the team of Hitler's former rocket scientists who had been brought to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip. And Walter was there with many of these folks, and initially the principal exercise was to test captured V2 weapons left over at the end of hostilities. And two of the incidents that Walter related to me are worthy of retelling. A V2 rocket, of course, was a 46-foot tall cylinder filled with alcohol and liquid oxygen, and designed to carry a warhead of 1 ton of explosives. Well, when one of these was tested, Walter said it, of course, went vertically upward, but suffered engine failure. And he said it had just disappeared from naked eye sight when we realized that the motor had cut out. And you knew that there was something the size of a locomotive that was going to be plummeting out of the sky, and that the result would make a hole in the ground tens of feet in depth as well as diameter. And there we stood, absolutely paralyzed, looking at one another, wondering, if we run over there, will we be killed, or will we be killed by staying here? Fortunately, it fell in a place where nobody got a scratch, but he said that was a very strange and very memorable feeling.
I bet.
The other story that he told was of a V2 with a bad gyroscope. And shortly after liftoff, it went horizontally south, landed within the city limits of Juarez, Mexico. Fortunately, the test was on the Cinco de Mayo, the Mexican national holiday, and this weapon fell within the confines of an old city cemetery, didn't injure a soul, and at the time, many people thought that it was part of the festivities.
Yeah.
The United States government, the military, was very interested in recovering this weapon and offered a reward for its remnants. And Walter said, Mexican peasants are surprisingly intelligent, because knowing that they would be paid for purported parts of this rocket, he said, our government paid for masses of metal exceeding the mass of the rocket by a factor of 3. So those are some Walter Haas reminiscences.
That is awesome. Thank you very much for sharing those. That's awesome. Now, in the world of astronomy and in the ALPO, there was a group, the Black Hole Gang. And you were lucky enough to be a part of that. And I think it was Don, it was Chick, it was you, Jeff Bish.
Don Parker, Chick Capon, Jeff Bish, Carlos Hernandez.
Yes.
Bish, Hernandez, and I still survive.
Mm-hmm.
Chick Capon, by the way, if I may digress.
Go for it.
Chick was an amazing man, a consummate scientist, and in many ways, Chick taught Don photography. I first met Chick in person after Chick had retired from Lowell Observatory and was living at, I believe, ancestral property of his wife, Ginny's, in Cuba, Missouri. In order to write Observing and Photographing the Solar System, Parker and I descended on Cuba, Missouri in July of 1985. And every day there, the local temperature was in the triple digits and the humidity was saturated. It was absolutely oppressive. Chick, who was a small, spry man, typical of fighter pilots. Chick flew P-51s and was a flight instructor during World War II. But Chick was light as a feather and didn't run the air conditioning in the house. Parker and I were afraid we were going to come down with malaria. We were just torpid because it was so hot. And Chick never had so much as a bead of sweat on his forehead. I believe it was on the third day that Parker complained about the heat, thinking that Chick must not have air conditioning. And Chick then asked, "Oh, would you like me to turn on the air conditioning?" To which Parker replied, "Do you have some sort of thyroid condition?" Of course we do. But Chick spent most of his time lightly clad in an Afrika Korps tunic and field cap. And he was just a tremendous fellow and always had great anecdotes to tell. You know, it's interesting that somebody my age, well, I knew Chick Capon, who knew many of the old hands at Lowell Observatory, and of course, Walter Haas spent the summer of 1938 in Jamaica, which is where he met his wife. She had been the personal secretary of the Harvard astronomer William Henry Pickering, who, somewhat disgraced, had retired from Harvard and set up a private observatory in Jamaica. And Walter spent the summer with this rather eccentric old astronomer with eccentric old ideas. And of course, Pickering himself had been at Lowell Observatory for a time at its founding, but it's amazing to me that I knew people who knew the people who were fundamental characters, for example, in the original controversy surrounding Martian canals and whether they were part of an irrigation network. Back to the other members of the Black Hole Gang. Jeff Bish, musician, has a Tennessee drawl, a towering intellect, and a true gift for mathematics. When Don met him in Miami, Jeff was working for United Airlines, designing and maintaining flight simulators. But Jeff, built some marvelous optimized planetary telescopes, was a really gifted visual observer, and still provides the ephemeris for each Mars apparition. One of our great adventures, which was capturing on videotape Martian flares back in 2001, the fact that we were able to predict that they might occur was largely based on software conceived by Jeff that let you find out the relative positions of the Earth, the Sun, and Mars for specular reflections. And by the way, in December of this year, that same Earth, Sun, Mars geometry will prevail, and there may be another opportunity to see Martian flares in Edom Promontorium again. And there is some lingering mystery to this day. There's certainly every reason to believe that these are specular reflections. Initially, we thought, well, they're probably from hexagonal plate ice crystals in the Martian, hovering in the Martian atmosphere, slowly descending to produce a phenomenon called the subsun when you look at it from an airplane here on Earth above a deck of cirrostratus clouds. What we found in 2001 was that these reflectors have to be on the surface because they're substantially inclined to the horizontal. And what their nature is, possibly minerals, possibly exposed patches of ice or frost on the faces of dunes, remains to be seen. But this will be a chance to attack that problem again.
Interesting. Huh. Yeah, I've tried to get Jeff on the podcast. I think I reach out to him every 6 months, and he'll say yes, then he'll say no, and say no, I just don't have the time right now. But he's a character, and I would love.
Yeah, he's becoming a bit reclusive. But
his
he's
knowledge
a great fellow, and certainly one of ALPO's great assets.
Yep, I agree. Interesting.
And of course, the late Tippy Dioria was a member of the Black Hole Gang. Tippy was really responsible for the very existence of the Winter Star Party in the Florida Keys. It's funny, South Florida, and in particular the Keys, are now renowned for just how good their astronomical seeing is. I mean, you've got, particularly in the Keys, very, very little diurnal temperature variation. It can be, and of course, the surrounding water has an inhibiting influence on just how hot it gets during the day. So it'll be in the low 90s, but by dawn, temperatures will have plummeted to the low 80s. Plus, you've got a laminar airflow. But I know that when Don Parker moved to Miami, he thought that he was doomed as far as doing astronomy because of an incredibly light polluted and presumably also turbulent observing site. And he was absolutely delighted to find that seeing in South Florida could be so good. But Tippy took advantage of that by founding the Winter Star Party. And Tippy was a former submariner and always a Navy man, and always very, very good company.
Okay. How about Don Parker?
Don was unique, and Don was the closest friend I ever had. And for a period of, almost 2 decades, there was never a day that went by that we did not talk on the telephone. Don, your really good friendships also tend to transform who you are. It's hard for me to talk about Don. In a day that goes by that I don't think about him and miss him.
Understand.
But
he was bigger than life.
His enduring influence on me was that he taught me that it's possible to be a very serious person without taking yourself too seriously. And Don had the richest sense of humor, the best wit of anyone I've ever met.
He could have been a stand-up comic. It was funny.
I don't know if it's appropriate for this podcast, but I assume you can edit it. On one occasion, from a podium fortunately with a very friendly audience, Don uttered the following words which brought down the house. And they were, Amateurs have contributed more to astronomy than to any science with the exception of gynecology. And I also recall when John Westfall inherited the editorship of the ALPO journal, and for a time it began to be published irregularly and chronically late, a situation that Ken Poshedly rescued. But at the annual ALPO meeting, Don, in remarks to the rest of the board from a podium, said, "Now that we've explained to John that quarterly doesn't mean every 4 years, I think everything will be fine."
Oh, God.
But Parker had a keen wit for every situation that was spontaneous, and he was a pioneer in dive physiology. He was an avid diver. He raced yachts, and he was very good at everything he did.
Yeah, I only met him a handful of times, but you meet him and it was just like you were old friends.
Yes.
And he was very warm and inviting, and I just remember his humor. It was always something funny that he had to say, and it's like, but his skills as a astrophotographer, I mean, they were unmatched at the time too.
They truly were, and Don, and this also goes for Jeff Bish as well, but Don was not only somebody who took incredible photographs of the planets, but when it came to both Mars and Jupiter in particular, Don was also good at doing really hard science in collaboration with leading professional astronomers like Leonard Martin at Lowell Observatory, with issues of Martian clouds and Martian climate and Martian polar cap regression. Don was not only good at amassing data, but he was also really good at giving it meaning. And that is a rare combination.
Very true. Wow. Yeah, he's definitely missed, and you are a lucky man to spend that much time with him as well.
I am indeed.
Yeah. So
if there's one thing that the worst part of growing old is watching your friends die, and that certainly goes for Don and Chick.
I hear you on that. Now, the name, the Black Hole Gang. Where did that? If you can say in on the air, where did it come from?
I have to confess, I don't know myself.
Oh, okay. It sounds like something Don would come up with. That's all. I'm just
Yes. I really don't know its origin.
Okay. All right. Interesting. So
if I had to ascribe it to anybody, it would probably be Tippy. In fact.
Oh, really?
Really.
Why is that?
Tippy had a sense of humor every bit as well developed as Don's, and it perhaps is buried somewhere deep in my subconscious, and the situation could be clarified with bright lights and a cattle prod, but I have some vague memories that Tippy came up with that name.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll believe that because you're the closest one to it. Now, in all the years you've seen the ALPO change, you mentioned the journal. It's publishing irregularities to where it is now. But what have you seen over the years in the ALPO? How has it changed for you?
Well, of course, Walter was really the glue that held everything together. And as Peggy's health declined and Walter aged, but there was some tumult until things were finally rectified by Westphal and others. John and Julius Benton and Ken ultimately got the ship righted. And in the evolution of ALPO, the advent of the web and instant communication, and probably in some respects injured the local astronomy club as an institution. But I think it's really helped ALPO as far as observers around the world, particularly with objects like Jupiter and Mars, who are able to instantly communicate and who monitor the planet thoroughly, both planets, as well as Saturn for that matter. But we fortunately, in people like Richard Schmude, are in very capable hands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recently was elected on the board to take Mike Reynolds' place, which are massive shoes to fill, and very
literally and figuratively, no doubt.
Yes, and very intimidating. And it's a good group that's running the ship right now. It really is. And Carl Hergenrother has just taken over the executive directorship of the organization, and he's got lots of things he wants to do. And I'm very happy with where the organization is right now.
As you should be.
Yeah. So, anything else about the ALPO you want to share before we move on?
It has been a source for me of a considerable number of enduring friendships, and it made it possible for me to meet and associate with some of the finest people that I've encountered in my life, as well as provide an outlet and a forum that has been an important part of my life.
That's very good. I like that. So, observing now, what type of observing equipment do you have?
I have a 6-inch refractor, a 7-inch Maksutov Cassegrain that is, simply because of its portability, the most frequently used instrument.
I hear you. I've gone the Maksutov trail too, just because of I can't move around like I used to and carry the big scopes around anymore, and the Maksutov fits that role very perfectly.
And quite frankly, its performance compared to the 6-inch refractor does not disappoint.
Good.
There is also a 12-inch Newtonian on a suitably massive German equatorial mount, which, perhaps to my wife's chagrin, is now largely relegated to the status of furniture.
It's that living room piece in the corner, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, mine are in the kitchen, which makes my wife very happy as well. So what are your interests now in astronomy? Are you still just planetary observing, or what other types of things are you doing?
I have been almost exclusively a planetary and to some extent a lunar observer all my life. And I can't say that I do any systematic visual observing. Observing for me has become largely an informal and recreational activity. But I suppose the aesthetic experience of seeing Jupiter, Saturn, or Mars is still something that is undiminished since my boyhood.
Very true. I like that. I like that a lot. So what other interests do you have outside of astronomy?
I have always been interested in history. In fact, my interest in history has in some ways spilled over and colored my interest in astronomy, since I try to weave in historical context whenever I write about astronomical subjects. And my historical interests are primarily the Second World War and the Cold War. I probably know more about the Second World War than I know about astronomy or the chemistry that I did for a living.
Really?
And I've also always been very interested in military aviation, but though with emphasis again on the Second World War. But another area of history that fascinates me a great deal, and the books collected about it occupy 2.5 shelves of the library, is the ongoing mystery of John Kennedy's assassination in 1963.
Interesting. Well, you've done more research on it than I have, so I'll leave that in your hands. Is there any other information you'd like to share with people before we end this?
No, it's been a pleasure.
It has. Tom, it's really good talking to you. I want to thank you again for coming on the podcast today. Your experience, your knowledge, your relationships with a lot of these people is invaluable. And I really appreciate the message getting out and talking about them.
Oh, it's been my pleasure and my honor. Thanks so much.
All right. Well, that'll do it for this exciting episode of the Observer's Notebook podcast. I really want to thank Tom Dobbins for coming on and giving us a little bit of background about the ALPO and his life and some of the amazing members that we've had in this organization as we celebrate 75 years of the ALPO. We upload a new episode of the Observer's Notebook on the 1st and 15th of every month. You can subscribe to us on iTunes. If you do, hey, head over there and give us a rating, a 5-star rating. I really appreciate it. It brings more people to the podcast. You can also listen to us on Apple Radio, iHeartRadio, Soundcloud, Spreaker, Google Play, Stitcher, Amazon Echo, Spotify, and also our new YouTube channel. All of the podcasts are uploaded on YouTube, so you can go over there and listen to them as well. Support the podcast by donating to it via Patreon. You can give up to $35 a month, where you'll receive 1 year's membership to the ALPO and producer credits on the podcast. And with that, I really want to thank the producers of this podcast, Steve Siedentop and Michael Moyer, for their generous support of the Observer's Notebook. The link for Patreon, as well as the link for the ALPO, is in the show notes. You can contact me via email at cometman@cometman.net or on Twitter at ObserversNBPod. And until next time, my hope is you always have clear and steady skies. Thanks for listening.